It is not always the same thing to be a good man and a good citizen. Aristotle. This quote by the great Greek philosopher sounds like a contradictory statement at first, but when we look at it through the eyes of civil disobedience and the ability to obey a man's uncorrupt morals and non-violently go against an unjust law, it begins to make sense. Civil disobedience can be the greatest solution under some circumstances involving unjust laws and/or a corrupt group of people that are abusing their powers. In this speech, I want to show you the great characteristics of civil disobedience through its nonviolent usage, the only person in jeopardy of the consequences of your actions is yourself, and the great impacts that you could possibly make. So the big question, is there violence involved in civil disobedience? The answer to that question is no. The definition of civil disobedience includes the fact that it is indeed nonviolent. In the words of Henry David Thoreau in his work Civil Disobedience, he says, "I have paid no poll tax for 6 years. I was put into jail once on this account." He said this after discussing that he only sees the government once a year, and that's when they come to take his money through the form of taxes. He didn't agree with this, so he decided he was going to break the law and try to prove his point that he didn't think this was right. He did it nonviolently, however. No one was harmed, and he paid his own price, but that we'll talk about that later. Martin Luther King Jr. preached the same sort of thing at the people following him at the March on Washington, and he said in his I Have a Dream speech, "We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence." He said this because he did not want the people following him to stoop down to the white man's level at that time. He didn't want African Americans to lose their dignity and respect for themselves for just to try to prove a point and stand up for something they wanted. He wanted them to keep a good head on their shoulders while they were fighting for something that they believed in. Our very own Declaration of Independence can even be looked at in this way because we nonviolently just wrote a paper for England and Great Britain that said, we no longer want to be a part of you. We don't agree with the king or anything that he's doing, so we'll see you later. Now, whether any of these were nonviolent or not, there's still the possibility of having consequences. But the only person that has to pay these consequences would be yourself, or at least the civil disobedient person. When Thoreau pulled his not paying taxes stunt, he was the only one who had to face any consequence. He did his time, and he just hoped that he would rub off on someone else who had the same view as him, and that they'd stand up for the same thing and get something started. But when he made his stand and trying to make his point, no one was harmed, and he paid his own consequence. If you follow him, you pay the same consequence. If you don't follow him, you go on living your day normally. With stands made like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks during their period of time, they would have to pay their consequences for their actions too. Rosa Parks sat down at the front of the bus, broke that law because she was an African American woman and there was a white woman that needed a seat. She refused to move, so she had to pay that consequence. Other people who didn't do the same thing as she didn't have to pay that consequence, and if someone decided to do the same thing later on, they would. And then even with Thoreau's mentioning of the majority to minority ideal, if I have an unpopular belief and I speak my mind and tell everybody else my belief, I will be the one that will have to face the consequence of ridicule and judgment and arguments that may come up because I said what I needed to say. And one thing that Thoreau said in his work, Civil Disobedience, was, why does the government not encourage its citizens to be on the alert to point out its faults and do better than it would have with them? And he says, why can't we accept some criticism that we get if people are just trying to make something better or just speak their mind about something? Because we all know if you have an unpopular belief and stand up for what you say, you may be looked down upon and people will ridicule you for saying that because they don't agree with you. Now, although only one person is the one facing these consequences of said actions, millions in the end may benefit from these said actions. I know this well, that if 1,000, if 100, if 10 men whom I could name, if 10 honest men only, if one honest man in this state of Massachusetts, ceasing to hold slaves, were actually to withdraw from this co-partnership and be locked up in the county jail therefore, it would be the abolition of slavery in America, is what Thoreau said in his work. And what he was saying was, even though one greatly looked upon man or woman made a stand for something they truly believed in, it would be bound that more and more people would follow them because they trust this person or are loyal to this person. And it might also help them to, well, I was thinking that before, so now I will stand up for that too. In the end, even a whole nation of people could begin to follow and end one unethical thing. Martin Luther King Jr. says, "And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, we will let it ring from every village, every hamlet, from every state, and every city." And he says this, and he's helping us envision where he sees his word going. He sees it going from the highest to lowest of places. He wants the people that were listening to him that day to take his word back and spread it and gather more people and help them stand up for something they believe to put an end to segregation and the unmoral treatment of how we were treating African American people at that time. This can even relate back all the way back to the Crucible, when Rebecca Nurse was accused of witchcraft. Rebecca Nurse was a sweet woman. She was known as the grandmother to everyone in the village. She did so much community service and was so wise. And all it took was one man, John Proctor, to stand up and take a stand and say, guys, this isn't right. To start this revolution of, he went to a small group of men and they got a number of petitions of more people saying, she's such a great woman, this can't be true, for it to finally turn back on Abigail, and people didn't believe her and people didn't believe the courts. Now, in this situation, it was a little too late. John Proctor and Rebecca Nurse had already been killed on this account, and Abigail Williams had already run away, but they still made their point, and people believed it in the end. So, in some cases, I do believe that civil disobeying law or order can be acceptable in the work of civil disobedience, when you are sticking up for what you believe is morally correct. We can't just end it there, so I call on you today to think about things, no matter how big or how small, that you do or follow that you don't either believe in or believe is morally acceptable, and stand up for your belief. Don't let others drag you down, and stand strong, because if you believe one way, I guarantee that someone else out there does too.